Most people don't fear losing the empath. They fear the moment the empath realizes they were never needed in the first place. Because once an empath stops chasing approval, stops explaining, stops trying to save everyone, something dangerous happens. They become emotionally untouchable, and people who once controlled them suddenly lose access to the one thing they depended on most, their emotional reaction. Empath eventually notices something most people never see. Attention is rarely innocent. It looks harmless in the beginning: the constant texting, the need for reassurance, the endless emotional conversations, the subtle guilt when you become unavailable. But underneath all of it is a deeper psychological transaction happening silently between people. Because attention is not always about love, connection, or care. Very often, attention is about access. Access to your emotions, access to your reactions, access to your nervous system. The moment someone can consistently influence your emotional state, they gain a form of invisible control over you. And the dangerous part is that empaths are usually conditioned to mistake emotional demand for emotional importance. They think being needed means being valued. It doesn't. Some people keep others emotionally exhausted on purpose because a tired mind becomes easier to influence. Watch human behavior closely and you'll see it everywhere. The person who suddenly becomes cold when you stop responding instantly. The friend who only reaches out during emotional chaos. The partner who creates tension right before you pull away emotionally. None of this is random. Human beings reveal their deepest intentions through patterns, not words. And emotionally intelligent manipulators understand one thing very clearly. If they can keep your attention, they can keep part of your identity attached to them. That is why silence unsettles certain people so deeply. When the empath stops reacting, stops explaining, stops defending every emotion, the entire dynamic changes. Suddenly, the person who once controlled the emotional rhythm no longer knows where they stand. That uncertainty creates anxiety because they lost access to the one thing they depended on: your emotional availability. This is why emotionally mature people become harder to manipulate over time. They stop giving instant emotional responses. They stop rewarding invasive behavior with attention. They begin observing energy instead of responding to words. And once an empath learns this, they can never unsee it. They start realizing that many conversations are not about understanding, they are about control disguised as concern. Some people ask questions not to know you, but to locate your emotional weak spots. Some people offer affection only to measure how much inside influence they still have over your mind. The empath finally understands that protecting attention is protecting identity itself. Because wherever your attention goes long enough, your emotional energy follows. And the people who panic when they can no longer reach your emotions were never connected to your soul in the first place. They were connected to their access to you. Most people think confrontation reveals truth. It rarely does. Confrontation changes behavior because the moment people feel observed, accused, or emotionally cornered, they begin managing perception instead of revealing intention. They adjust their tone. They rehearse innocence. They become strategic. Human beings are naturally adaptive when their image is threatened. That is why emotionally reactive people often stay trapped in confusion for years. They keep demanding answers from people who have already learned how to perform the right emotions under pressure. But emotional detachment works differently. Detachment removes the emotional noise that normally blinds perception. When you stop chasing clarity through confrontation and start observing quietly, people expose themselves with shocking speed. Because most individuals rely on your emotional involvement to hide their patterns. The manipulator survives through your reactions. The liar survives through your need to believe them. The attention seeker survives through your emotional participation. But the moment you emotionally step back, the performance begins collapsing under its own weight. Suddenly, you notice things you were never supposed to notice. The delayed responses that only happen when they lose control of your attention. The subtle guilt tactics disguised as concern. The way certain people become irritated when they can no longer predict your emotions. Detachment turns behavior into evidence. And evidence is difficult to argue against. Watch what happens when you stop over-explaining yourself. Watch how quickly certain people create conflict just to force emotional engagement again. That is not connection. That is dependency disguised as attachment. Emotionally detached people become dangerous observers because they no longer need the illusion to survive. They are no longer trying to win the interaction emotionally. They are studying it. And the uncomfortable truth is that human beings reveal themselves more through what frustrates them than what comforts them. A person's mask usually falls apart the moment they lose influence over your emotional state. That is why silence unsettles manipulative personalities more than arguments ever could. Silence gives them nothing to work with, no defense to attack, no emotional chaos to redirect, no weakness to hook into, just distance, observation, stillness. And most people become deeply uncomfortable when they can no longer control how they are emotionally perceived. Real emotional intelligence is not reacting perfectly. It is learning to separate observation from emotional absorption. Because once you stop drowning in people's words, you start hearing the patterns underneath them. And patterns never lie. The truth is, emotional detachment is not coldness. It is clarity without emotional interference. And the moment you master that skill, people stop telling you who they are, they start showing you without realizing it. The empath eventually reaches a point that looks cold from the outside but is actually one of the highest forms of emotional intelligence. They stop trying to be understood, not because they have nothing to say, but because they finally recognize a brutal truth about human behavior. Most people do not listen to understand you, they listen to protect their own self-image. And once you see that clearly, something inside you changes permanently. The empath spends years over explaining intentions, clarifying emotions, defending kindness, trying to make people see the purity behind their actions. But the more emotionally aware they become, the more they realize that understanding is not blocked by communication. It is blocked by emotional capacity. People can only understand you to the depth they understand themselves. And that realization is deeply uncomfortable because it means some individuals will misinterpret you no matter how honest, patient, or transparent you are. Watch what happens in real life. The empath explains their pain calmly, but the manipulator hears accusation. The empath sets a boundary respectfully, but the emotionally immature person hears rejection. The empath becomes quiet, and suddenly others invent stories to fill the silence. Why? Because human beings project their internal state onto everything they cannot emotionally control. Most reactions are confessions in disguise. This is why evolved empathy. EHS stop wasting energy trying to force emotional clarity into people who benefit from misunderstanding them. They understand that constant self-explanation is often a hidden form of seeking permission to exist peacefully. And the moment you stop needing everyone to validate your intentions, you reclaim an enormous amount of psychological power. Silence becomes selective. Words become intentional. You no longer rush to correct every false perception because you realize something dangerous. People who truly value you look for understanding, while people who need control look for flaws. The empath starts noticing how quickly certain people become irritated when access to their inner world is reduced. Some individuals are not upset because they lost connection with you. They are upset because they lost emotional visibility into you. They can no longer predict your reactions, monitor your feelings, or manipulate your empathy through guilt and emotional pressure. That uncertainty disturbs them more than your absence ever could. The empath finally learns that privacy is power. Emotional mystery is power. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your thoughts, your wounds, or your sensitivity. Yes. Because the harsh truth is this. Some people study your vulnerability not to protect it, but to use it later when it benefits them emotionally. And once the empath understands that, they stop trying to convince people of who they are. They let patterns speak louder than explanations. They let silence expose intentions. They let distance reveal loyalty, because mature people seek truth, but manipulative people seek emotional leverage. And the moment you stop needing to be understood by everyone, you become impossible to emotionally trap. Human beings are far more obsessed with predictability than they admit. Most relationships are not built on deep emotional connection, they are built on behavioral certainty. People feel comfortable when they can predict your reactions, your forgiveness, your emotional patterns, even your breaking point. The moment they know what triggers you, what softens you, and what keeps you attached, they gain psychological stability around you. That stability becomes a form of control. This is why emotionally reactive people are often easier to manipulate. Their responses become routines. If someone knows you will always answer the long emotional message, then they know you're a good listener. Always chase after distance, always apologize first, or always tolerate disrespect after a small amount of guilt. Your behavior becomes programmable. And the dangerous part is that most empaths mistake this predictability for loyalty. They believe consistency proves love. But in reality, predictable emotional behavior often teaches people how to manage you instead of respect you. Then something changes. The empath becomes quieter, slower to react, harder to read. They stop explaining every emotion immediately. They stop revealing every internal thought. They stop giving instant reassurance to people who create emotional confusion. And suddenly, the people around them begin acting strangely unsettled. Watch closely when this happens in real life. The person who once ignored you now becomes obsessed with your silence. The emotionally unavailable partner suddenly becomes attentive when they realize your emotional dependency is disappearing. Friends who took your kindness for granted become suspicious the moment your energy becomes selective. Why? Because unpredictability creates psychological tension. Human beings instinctively fear losing control over environments they once understood. When they can no longer predict your emotional responses, they lose their ability to emotionally navigate you with confidence. That uncertainty activates anxiety, curiosity, and sometimes even obsession. This is why emotionally disciplined people often appear powerful without saying much. Their calmness removes emotional predictability. They cannot be easily baited into reactions. They do not reveal every wound under pressure. They do not hand people emotional maps to navigate their mind. And most individuals become deeply uncomfortable around someone they cannot emotionally read. Not because mystery is magical, but because unpredictability removes leverage. The evolved empath understands this at a deep level. They realize that overexposure weakens emotional authority. Constant emotional transparency teaches people exactly how to influence your state of mind. So instead of reacting impulsively, they begin observing first. They become intentional with silence, intentional with presence, intentional with access. And the uncomfortable truth is this: many people are not attached to who you are. They are attached to the version of you they learned how to predict. The moment that ion disappears, panic begins surfacing beneath their behavior. Because when people can no longer control your emotional rhythm, they are finally forced to confront their own. And for many people, that is far more terrifying than losing you. The empath eventually discovers one of the most uncomfortable truths about human behavior. Constantly rescuing people does not always heal them. Sometimes it quietly trains them to remain broken. At first, helping feels noble. The empath listens longer, forgives faster, sacrifices more, absorbs emotional weight that was never theirs to carry. They believe love means protecting people from pain, stress, failure, and consequences. But over time, something disturbing begins to emerge. The same people keep repeating the same destructive patterns. The same chaos returns in different forms. The same emotional emergencies appear right when accountability is required. And the empath slowly realizes that some individuals are not searching for solutions at all. They are searching for someone emotionally generous enough to interrupt the consequences of their behavior. This is where emotional intelligence becomes dangerous, because emotionally dependent people often disguise dependency as vulnerability. They know exactly how to trigger the empath's protective instincts: the sad story, the emotional collapse, the guilt-filled silence, the sudden helplessness right before responsibility arrives. Most people never notice this because they are focused on words instead of behavioral cycles. But patterns reveal intention far more honestly than emotions do. Watch closely how some individuals react when you stop rescuing them. They rarely become stronger immediately. First, they become angry, confused, or emotionally manipulative. Why? Because your rescue was never just kindness to them, it became psychological certainty. They adapted to your intervention. Human beings naturally repeat behaviors that remove discomfort. If someone knows you will always fix the emotional damage, absorb the stress, lend the energy, or carry the emotional burden, growth becomes unnecessary. This is why overhelping can quietly create emotional weakness in others. The empath starts understanding that suffering is not always cruelty. Sometimes suffering is feedback. Consequences teach lessons that comfort never could. And the moment the empath stops interfering, with every emotional fire, people are finally forced to face themselves without distraction. That is when true character appears. Some people rise. Others search desperately for a new emotional caretaker. The evolved empath learns to recognize the difference between someone temporarily struggling and someone psychologically attached to being rescued. One seeks growth. The other seeks dependency disguised as connection. And the harsh truth is that many relationships survive only because one person keeps emotionally overfunctioning while the other avoids accountability. The empath eventually realizes that constantly saving people was often a hidden attempt to earn value through usefulness. That realization changes everything. Because mature empathy no longer means carrying everyone emotionally. It means knowing when your help heals and when it merely delays someone's confrontation with themselves. And the moment you stop rescuing people from the consequences of who they are, you discover who was truly trying to grow and who was simply trying to keep access to your strength. The empath becomes truly dangerous the moment they stop needing anything from anyone emotionally. Most people never reach this level because human behavior is built around invisible dependency, the need for approval, the need to be chosen, the need for reassurance, validation, attention, affection, or constant emotional confirmation. These needs quietly control the behavior of almost everyone. They shape conversations, relationships, even identity itself. People change their personality to avoid rejection. They tolerate disrespect to avoid loneliness. They stay emotionally attached to situations that are destroying them simply because the mind fears emotional withdrawal more than emotional suffering. But the empath who evolves beyond this becomes psychologically difficult to control. Because once someone no longer needs external emotional permission to feel whole, manipulation begins losing its grip entirely. Watch human behavior carefully, and you will notice something unsettling. The moment people realize they cannot emotionally hook you anymore, their behavior changes immediately. The guilt stops working. The silent treatment loses power. Emotional inconsistency no longer creates panic inside you. Why? Because emotional control only works when there is something inside you still begging. Need to be fed. Most manipulation is simply the exploitation of emotional hunger. The hunger to feel loved, significant, safe, seen. But the evolved empath learns how to generate emotional stability internally instead of outsourcing it to unstable people. That changes everything about their presence. They stop entering rooms trying to be liked. They stop over-explaining boundaries to avoid upsetting others. They stop performing emotional loyalty for people who offer conditional respect. And strangely, this is often the moment people become most drawn to them. Because human beings instinctively sense when someone is emotionally self-contained. It creates a quiet tension, a calmness that cannot be emotionally purchased or easily shaken. Most people are constantly leaking emotional need through their behavior without realizing it through oversharing, chasing, reacting too quickly, needing immediate responses, needing closure, needing reassurance. But the empath who has mastered emotional detachment moves differently. Their silence is not insecurity. Their distance is not fear. Their restraint is intentional. They observe more than they reveal. They no longer hand people emotional instructions. They control on how to control them. And this unsettles emotionally manipulative personalities deeply because people can only emotionally dominate what still seeks emotional reward from them. The empath finally realizes that true freedom is not becoming cold, it is becoming emotionally disciplined enough that your peace no longer depends on someone else's behavior. That is real power. Not dominance, not intimidation, emotional independence. The ability to walk away from what disrespects your mind without needing revenge, explanation, or emotional closure. And the harsh truth is this: the moment people realize they can no longer control your emotions, many of them will no longer know how to relate to you at all. Because some people were never connected to your soul, they were connected to your emotional dependency.